Federal government empowers more than 11,000 youths with various industrial skills.
Your degree certificates just gives you an added advantage and prepares you for the challenges of the future. But the skills that you acquire and have is what would entrench you in the marketplace of today.
On Good Morning Nigeria today, we shall focus on medical diagnosis and the Nigerian healthcare system. All right, the Nigerian healthcare system is struggling with a lot of challenges, among which are inadequate medical facilities, paucity of qualified personnel, fake and adulterated drugs and supplies, and a host of others.
Certainly, Kingsley, there has also been the issue of medical tourism, which makes well-to-do Nigerians, especially politicians, travel out of the country to treat even minor ailments. It is estimated that about $1.2 billion is lost to medical tourism yearly in the country.
Exactly, Kirian. However, one problem that is also bedeviling the Nigerian healthcare system is the issue of wrong or faulty diagnosis, or what you may of course call misdiagnosis of ailments by health institutions. Of course, this comes at a great cost, usually, to human life.
Yes, indeed, diagnosis is the process of identifying a disease condition or injury from its signs and symptoms. And health experts will say a health history, physical examination, and medical tests, such as blood tests and biopsies that may be used to help make diagnosis.
But sometimes cases arise where some patients who are undergoing treatment do not respond to prescribed medication, and the health condition obviously gets worse and could sometimes lead to death. And in such cases, there is a suspicion of wrong diagnosis.
And that is exactly why we want to focus on the issue of medical diagnosis and the Nigerian healthcare system.
All right. Now, essentially, we shall be asking such questions as what is the structure for medical diagnosis, and what are the causes of wrong diagnosis or misdiagnosis, and how can they be corrected? And usually, what is the fate of those who have been affected by wrong diagnosis, or those, in fact, who made the wrong diagnosis in the first instance?
And we have assembled experts who will provide answers to all these questions and more in the course of the program. Today also on the show, we shall discuss bills President Muhammadu Buhari withheld assent. In fact, Kingsley, a number of bills that the president, seven of them, that he refused to assent to, right. Which I get to know the reasons why. My name is Kirian Umaya. Thank you for joining us on the program today.
And I'm Kingsley Osadolo. I join my colleague Kira in also welcoming you to the program being broadcast live on the network service of the Nigerian Television Authority. We are here at our Abuja headquarters studios. And as always, we'll have complimentary segments of the program, including newspaper review, business, and others. In the meantime, let's take the highlights of the morning news. And here's our colleague, Najatu Tijani. Hi, Najatu. Good morning.
Hello, Kingsley and Kirian. It's good to see you this morning. I'm Najatu Tijani with the news. President Muhammadu Buhari is in Amman, Jordan, ahead of the World Economic Forum on the Middle East and North Africa, holding at the Dead Sea region. State House correspondent Adamu Sambo reports that the president, who is a special invitee of the Jordanian King Abdullah bin al-Hussein, was accorded a befitting reception on arrival.
I think it's highly significant for our country, the fact that our president has been invited to present a keynote address shows that he's doing something that the world has noticed. The world knows where he met the Nigerian economy and where the economy is now and where he is taking it to.
And President Muhammadu Buhari has kept his promise that governance will not take the back seat in spite of his busy campaigns leading to the 2019 presidential elections. A statement by the special advisor to the president on media and publicity, Femi Adesina, says major activities and achievements recorded during the campaign period include minimum wage bill, strategic revenue growth initiative, and the signing of Executive Order Number 7 on road infrastructural development. He also noted that the campaign period didn't affect ongoing federal government construction projects, notably roads, rails, and power across the country. There was also significant economic growth during the period under review. Femi Adesina quoted figures of the National Bureau of Statistics, which says that in the fourth quarter of 2018, the country's economy grew by 2.38% and 1.93% for the whole year. And now the Oba of Benin, Oba Ewari II, has congratulated President Muhammadu Buhari and Vice President Professor Yemi Osinbajo for their victory in the recently concluded presidential election. In a statement by the Secretary, Benin Traditional Council, Frank Irabo, the Oba also extends his wishes to winners in the National, State Assembly and gubernatorial elections. The statement commiserates with families of those who lost their lives and properties in the electoral process and commends INEC for ensuring free and fair elections. And now the Buhari Media Organization has described as totally untrue and unverifiable the global report on food crisis affecting some countries, including Nigeria. A statement by the chairman of the group, Ni Akinsiju, says the report released by the United Nations Food and Agricultural Organization is untenable, bearing in mind that under Buhari's administration, there has been an increase in agricultural activities leading to sufficiency in food production and availability. According to the group, there has been deliberate measures taken by the federal government to ensure adequate food for the victims of the Boko Haram insurgency due to the intervention by different agencies cooperating with the federal government in ensuring adequate food for people in conflict-affected areas. The group maintains that it runs contrary to reason that an organization like the United Nations or any of its agencies would lump Nigeria with countries like Yemen, Syria, and Afghanistan, where there are full-blown wars. President Muhammadu Buhari joins all members of the All Progressives Congress, APC, in felicitating with party chairman Comrade Adams Oshomole on his 67th birthday, congratulating him for providing purposeful, courageous, and tenacious leadership. In a statement by the Special Advisor to the President on Media and Publicity, Femi Adesina, President Buhari affirms that Comrade Oshomole, after many years of serving as a Labour leader, brought a new dynamism into the collective effort to making democracy and development more inclusive in the country, recognizing his vibrant relationship with Nigerian workers and ordinary people. As the chairman of the APC, the president believes the strides recorded in the last elections across the country clearly testify to Oshomole's visionary and vibrant leadership, commending his efforts at building a strong and unified party that is focused on strengthening the internal democracy and developing the country. While rejoicing with family members, friends, and political associates of the APC chairman on the milestone, President Buhari describes him as a man of conviction who stands resolutely by whatever he believes in. The President therefore prays that the Almighty God will grant the party chairman longer life, good health, and wisdom in serving the country and its citizens. And the federal government is desirous of leveraging on the potency of information and communication technology in driving its economic recovery and growth plan. The Permanent Secretary, Federal Ministry of Information and Culture, Deaconess Grace Isu Gigby, stated this in a message at the opening ceremony of an ICT capacity building program in Abuja.
Information and communication technology has systematically transformed the social awareness of Nigerians in line with global best practices. Nigeria, like most developing nations, have come to recognize the importance of information and communication technology as a catalyst for sustainable socio-economic development.
Similarly, more than 11,000 Nigerians have been trained in various industrial vocations under the National Industrial Skills Development Program of the federal government. Vice President Yemi Osinbajo, in a message at the graduation ceremony in Abuja, expressed the present administration's determination to fast-track industrial growth and provide gainful employment for the teeming youth in the country.
Certificates just gives you an added advantage and prepares you for the challenges of the future. But the skills that you acquire and have is what would entrench you in the marketplace of today.
Where training occurs without the accompanying empowerment tools, the results become less impactful.
Problem of skills as an enabler in implementation of the Nigeria Industrial Revolution Plan will continue to be accorded prime status in the implementation of the plan of government.
And that's the news for now. Good morning. Nigeria continues with Kingsley and Kirian after this break.
Son, being good at something requires strength. It requires pushing yourself. It requires putting in more. That's why the new improved Bornvita is packed with vitality and a great taste.
A new edition of TV Guide is out with special focus on the role of the media in election coverage. Exclusive on the National Broadcasting Commission, its mandate as the sole regulator of Nigerian media. Dr. Toma Dabaden and Ishak Modibo Kawu. Now, this edition also features the king of stand-up comedy in Nigeria, Ali Baba. NTA standards to be ready for election transmission after decades of abandonment. Find out from the DG transactional elections in our political space. An evil wind that blows no good. DG, National Orientation Agency, calls for TV Guide, your indispensable companion, x-rays the impact of social media on electioneering process as electorates present their expectations from incoming government. Meet some TV professionals behind the screen and other inspiring stories in sports, entertainment, and lots more. Grab a copy at the vendor near you or NTA stations nationwide. TV Guide, your indispensable companion.
If you hear a bomb explosion or gunshots of an active shooter, that might be a terror attack. At such times, always remember 3 action words. Run, hide, report. Don't try to run towards the terror scene to save the situation, because there might be a second bomb blast or another attack. Run far away and take cover. Make sure you are safe first. Yes, it is in our nature to sympathize over the hurt, but remember, only trained personnel can help in such situations. When in a secured environment, promptly call relevant authorities and help will come. For anonymous reporting, call 09630-3250-5 or 0813-2222-106. If you see something, say something. Nigeria unite against terrorism. This message is brought to you by the Federal Ministry of Information and Culture.
We thank you for staying with us on Good Morning Nigeria today. Now to business. Micro, small and medium enterprises in Nigeria are getting sufficient buoy to expand business and attain dependability for economic stability. This and more will be brought to you by Kolo Mohammed on Business News.
Glad to have you join us on Business News. In order that national economies attain sustainable potentials, micro, small and medium enterprises have been identified as key. Nigeria's business registration organ, the Corporate Affairs Commission, is leveraging on the reduction of registration charges by decentralizing the process via an online portal.
The full decentralization of operations, which you are all aware of, that you can start and finish your businesses from any of our offices across Nigeria. deployment of the company's registration portal, which has made it possible for us to have the pre-registration online. And of course, this is also achieved in 24 hours once you submit all the requirements.
More registered businesses means capturing more people into the tax net, putting more money at government's disposal, translating into bigger and better services for the people. In the same vein, assets in Central Bank of Nigeria's National Collateral Registry hits 1.561 trillion naira. On this, the Apex Bank says it will boost lending by financial institutions with well over 1.23 trillion naira. This process allows borrowers to seek credit from any financial institution, leveraging assets like jewelry, farm products, and vehicles as collateral. Micro, small, and medium enterprise owners and operators are encouraged to embrace this opportunity in order to stabilize businesses and grow operational base. And finally, from the stock market, NSE All-Share Index dropped by minus 0.039%. The market closed at 29,553.12 basis points. Up ahead is a graphic summary on how trading on Thursday went down. That's business news at this time. I am Kolo Muhammad. Many thanks for your time.
All right, thank you very much, Kolo Muhammad, for the business package on Good Morning Nigeria. Up next for us now is a review of some of the papers we have this morning.
And here we have Bayo Atoyebi, our newspaper reviewer. Bayo, good morning and welcome.
Thank you, Kirian. Good morning. Good morning, Kingsley. Good morning, Nigeria.
All right. Kirian, we have a number of papers. That's right. Let's begin with the leadership. Leadership newspaper, that's below the nameplate. You have 3 headlines there, plus the lead story. And the first headline we're taking there says, President Muhammadu Buhari rolls out achievements in 4 years. Details of that can be found on page 4. Kolade, that's the gentleman who was killed at a football viewing center. Police dismiss killer cop. That's on page 2. Nigeria's debt hits 24.38 trillion naira. That's Nigeria's debt. Details of that can be found on page 17. NFIU, that's the Nigerian Financial Intelligence Unit, to publish assets of politicians and public officers. EFCC recovers 251 billion naira in 15 months. And you also have another headline there. It says, Jeff Bezos remains the wealthiest man. And Mackenzie Bezos becomes the 3rd wealthiest woman in the world. Now, right at the foot of the front page there, on the front page of the leadership newspaper, protest, that's the kicker. Court orders Saraki, Melaye, and Ben Bruce to honor police invitation. NNPC intensifies search for oil in the north, and man arrested for killing wife in Kano.
All right, let's turn to the Daily Trust newspaper for today. Below the nameplate, we have some stories there. Assets of politicians, public officials to be made public, and that's what Kingsley just read a short while ago. And then Onogen lawyers differ over NJC's report to Buhari. It's on page 4. And then kidnapping, ACF asks federal government to re-examine strategy. It's on page 3. And now the lead story on the Daily Trust newspaper. Alleged husband killing, that's the kicker. You have case to answer. Court tells Miriam Sanda discharges her mother, brother, and housemaid. That story is captured on page 5 of Daily Trust newspaper, where you may recall that story. Bayo will lead us, when he gets to him. And now, at the foot of the Daily Trust, just before that, you can see a photograph there, a photograph on the Daily Trust newspaper. That's one of the rooms gutted by fire at the National Youth Service Corps Permanent Orientation Camp in Wamako, local government area of Sokoto State. That happened on Wednesday. And now at the foot of the Daily Trust, we have Buhari travels to Jordan for Economic Forum. It's on page 4. AIB concludes investigations on Suntai's plane crash and 5 others. You have that on page 8. Now Nigeria attracted $6 billion FDI in 3 months, says CBN. Let's get to Bayo now.
Yes, let's start with 2 running stories. One is on the football fan who was shot dead, Kolade Johnson, and the other is on the issue of kidnapping. The police inspector involved in the death of Kolade Johnson has been dismissed from the force. After an orderly room trial, the sergeant that was equally detained has been discharged and acquitted because he was not found incriminated. The inspector, Ugunyemi Olaleka, was found guilty and of 3 charges against him. He has been handed over to the State Criminal Intelligence and Investigation Department for prosecution. The adjudicating officer at the orderly room trial handed down dismissal from service and prosecution. On the issue of kidnapping, Arewa Consultative Forum has called on federal government to examine its security apparatus and make it effective to tackle rising incidences of kidnapping. The ACF says that reports of kidnapping on the highway, especially between villages in Kaduna-Abuja highway by bandits, have gone on the increase and has led to several hundreds of deaths. The Consultative Forum says that frequency of kidnapping, especially along Kaduna-Abuja highway, as well as the villages in Zamfara, Sokoto, Katsina, and Kaduna, and other parts of the country by unknown gunmen is cruel, barbaric, and inhuman. The government, it says government and security agencies should redouble their efforts, particularly in area of intelligence and strategy, to put an end to the menace. Meanwhile, the interstate commercial drivers and villagers have confirmed that to Daily Trust that kidnapping is prominent along Kaduna and Niger State borders. The communities in Niger are Munya, Rafi, Shiroro, and Niger State, while the others are in Biriningwari and Serkin Power area in Kaduna State. They say that bandits have been taking refuge in forests around Niger and Kaduna border that spans across to Zamfara. Independent Petroleum Marketers Association, IPMAN, also says that it has 20 of its members that were kidnapped in 2018. So much so that they lost about 5 trucks along Kaduna, Biriningwari, Kagara, Tejina highway. Because of that, they have abandoned and boycotted that access. And the Nigeria Communications Commission is also saying that kidnappers are actually using unregistered SIM cards to commit their crime. The executive vice chairman of the NCC, Umar Dampada, says that the task force has been set up to tackle that menace. Meanwhile, the NCC is tracking the criminals who are using unregistered SIM cards.
Let me ask you this question, Kingsley, this Kaduna highway kidnapping is becoming endemic because, if such does not happen to somebody you may see that as just a story. There was a guy just last week, he's a staff of NIMET. Oh, yeah. He traveled, and on his way back, he actually caught the journey, into 2, from Katsina to Kaduna. He, passed the night in Kaduna, and then took off the next day. And behold, this guy was among those who were kidnapped. Meanwhile, he had the fatal accident about 3 months ago and can barely walk. He uses a stick. And he is involved in the last kidnapping. So, we wonder why these hoodlums have persisted in terms of their accuracy, the way they strike, and they take a good number of people, up to 30.
In fact, the brazenness is that they do it in broad daylight. And you recall that when the Abuja airport was under construction, security was heightened along Kaduna-Abuja Expressway, and all those incidences dissipated. But with banditry in Zamfara and parts of Kaduna State, and with the initiative of the Air Force and the security in that place, apparently they are running away from those areas, and now this is the axis where they are, has become their hideout. Forests between Niger and Kaduna states have become their hideouts. And the only way they can survive is to frequently make forays into the Abuja-Kaduna Express Highway, where there is heavy traffic and they are becoming a nuisance there. Apparently, citizens are now very conscious of it, and people flying between Kaduna and Abuja now prefer to use the train than use the highway because of the heightened dangers there. But the police high command has also redoubled their initiative. They have recalled their operations for that highway, and I think they are doing something about it. And it needs to be done very fast.
Yeah, you know, Bayo, we discussed this a couple of days ago, because there was a report of the Kaduna State Governor foiling another kidnap attempt. That was probably on Tuesday, because he was on his way to Abuja, and then, of course, broad daylight, you know, vehicles were all at a standstill because the kidnappers were operating ahead. So there were a number of persons who were injured, you know, as a result of the gunshots that were fired. Last weekend, there were also reports, you know, of kidnapping. So it looks like almost a daily occurrence. Now, that is just one part of it. Elsewhere in the country, Ondo, in Ondo State, the story is the same. In Oyo, the story is the same. You go to the southeast, you go to the Benin or Shagamu highway.
I just read one article, you know, where, well, I'm not sure whether it's correct or not, that the governor of Kaduna State has there's already a law now that stipulates the fact that any person caught kidnapping should be dealt with summarily. Perhaps it attracts death sentence now.
Well, I think was it Lagos State? Lagos, when you remember the time when they were kidnapping involving even secondary school students, there was the Lagos State Assembly, I think, passed a law that says that kidnapping was a term of imprisonment. Where the kidnapping involved death, then there was going to be death penalty. So that kind of initiative across the nation, I think, will go a long way in stemming it.
Yeah, part of the curiosity in all of it, there are two things that I find a bit curious. The ransom they collect would normally run into millions of naira. And these gangs do it repeatedly. So how do they save the money? Where do they save the money?
And what do they even do with the
money?
money?
What do they do with the money? Because when you see a few of them that have been arrested, they look like miscreants. So where does the ransom go to? To whom does the ransom go? These are millions. They collect, you know, from... all right, Kyria, let's go ahead with other headlines. Yes, let me take New Telegraph. Below the nameplate of New Telegraph, you have this Nigeria's total debt hits. I already read that, 24.38 trillion naira. That's below the nameplate of the New Telegraph now. And then FUTO, that's Federal University of Technology, Owerri, sex romp. Another student dies. That's on page 8. That's a very sad story. A group of students, you know, were said to have been involved in some illicit affair in a hotel or one of the off-campus locations. Found, you know, in their location there, they said codeine. They said there was codeine, there was tramadol, there was vodka, and Indian hemp. So
a combination of
yeah, that's right.
Cocktail.
A cocktail of medications, so all kinds of aphrodisiacs that put them to sleep. Now, how Ethiopian Airlines nosedived several times before crash, that's according to a report. You have other stories there. Entertainers resort to politics, fashion, school, real estate, and restaurant to stay afloat. Okay.
And from the Nigerian pilot, well, it's just one story I want to take from the Nigerian pilot, that's the lead story on the Nigerian pilot. EFCC recovers 251 billion naira, and of course, $292 million, says Magu, that's the acting EFCC chairman. And now with the 4 riders, says they include 11.5 billion final forfeiture cash and 133.8 billion non-forfeiture. that monies were recovered from government agencies. Properties worth millions of dollars also recovered. Asks for 22.071 billion naira for 2019 fiscal year. Let's begin by once more.
Let me quickly bring an update on the elections. INEC has expressed satisfaction with the outcome of the elections in Rivers State. Rising from a meeting, INEC indicated that supplementary elections are to be held in 4 constituencies. These are Gukana, Opobo Nkoro, Ahoada West, and Abua Odua. INEC has set up a committee also to ascertain the allegations of misconduct in Imo North Senatorial District. The committee will advise if the procedures were complied with by the officials. A report is to be submitted by Wednesday, 10th of April. Meanwhile, 2019 election, the Tribune says 2019 election have come and gone. However, the election that was meant to have been for over 3 weeks spanned over 6 weeks and beyond. However, the paper notes that of the 29 governorship election, APC won 15 states. The People's Democratic Party won 14 states. Apparently, by May 29th, All Progressive Congress is expected to have about 20 states, the PDP about 15, and APGA 1.
All right, that's interesting. Let's go to the editorial for this morning, and it's from the Tribune. It's from the Tribune on page 5. Of Cyclone Idai and preparedness for disasters. Millions of hapless citizens of Mozambique, Malawi, and Zimbabwe are still mourning and counting their losses over this cyclone. Well, Bayo, you've gone through this, you know, and we have also in the past talked about the issue of Nigeria's preparedness in case of such natural disasters.
Well, one thing I'm curious about reading about cyclone is that why is it that cyclones and tornadoes are often given feminine names? It's a phenomenon that is very strange in meteorology. I don't understand why. But this particular one, the cyclone, affected Mozambique, Malawi, and Zimbabwe. Yes. The nexus was specifically on Mozambique, where death toll reached about 746 persons were died, and about 99,317 homes were destroyed. The kernel of the editorial is that while many nations are garnering support to give succor to the 3 nations that are affected, it is a warning signal to other African nations to be prepared in terms for some of these unforeseen disasters when they come. And the recommendation is that there should be strong leadership and also planning, and particularly application of technology to be able to bring remedy to those who become victims of such unforeseen natural hazards.
I think the key word here is applying technologies, you know, because African countries seem to be, they are lagging behind in terms of application of technologies to, you know, handle such situations. Now we've just been discussing about the kidnapping, you know, along Kaduna Expressway, and the technologies can also, you know, assist in tracking and trapping, you know, the perpetrators.
One of the easiest pieces of technology to deploy is a drone.
Yes.
If they say that the kidnappers are in the forest, you send up your drone. You don't have to go there. Absolutely.
Some can stay 24 hours or more.
Absolutely.
You know.
And talking about cyclone, there was information about the cyclone coming, although cyclone is not very frequent on the African continent. But there was information about cyclone coming. And cyclone is a wild wind that is very devastating. Then when you hear in other places where they are familiar with tsunamis and tornadoes, once the warning comes, they have camps and area where they evacuate people immediately. But for us here, most often than not, because we are not familiar with this natural disaster, sometimes it catches us napping, and most of the time very unprepared. And that is when the consequences become very, very grave.
Yeah, and we also have to bear in mind that the 3 countries affected by Cyclone Idai, these are poor countries: Mozambique, Zimbabwe, and Malawi. And in the case of the areas that were worse, apart from Beira, which is a port city in Mozambique, Chimandimani and the other villages, you know, these are poor neighborhoods. Incidentally, when Kyria was talking about using technology, one of the first things that you saw upon the cyclone hitting Chimandemani and other surrounding villages is that those who survived and were now looking for their family members who were missing were physically trying to lift boulders. These are rocks because the fact that their family members who were buried. Yes, I mean, for how long can you do that?
And
yes.
you know, one dangerous aspect of this is that, as Bayo was trying to say, when a cyclone comes, it can trigger tsunami, depending on the terrain, right? So sometimes they come in, it's like a chain reaction. When cyclone comes, it triggers all forms of reaction because, of course, so many rivers will of course, grow beyond its bounds and all of that, and of course, erosion can also set in.
All right, Bayo, I'd like to thank you for being with us today and indeed all through the week. We hope you enjoy your weekend.
Thank you very much.
We'll see you on Monday. All right, it's Good Morning Nigeria, still on the network service of the NTA. We'll take a short break now. When we return, of course, we'll be talking about the issue of diagnosis in the healthcare system, plus the bills for which President Muhammadu Buhari has declined assent.
A new edition of TV Guide is out with special focus on the role of the media in election coverage. Exclusive on the National Broadcasting Commission, its mandate as the sole regulator of Nigerian media. Dr. Toba Daba then and Ishak Modibo Kawu now. This edition also features the king of stand-up comedy in Nigeria, Ali Baba. NTA standard to be ready for election transmission after decades of abandonment. Find out from the DG transactional elections in our political space. An evil wind that blows no good. DG, National Orientation Agency, calls for TV Guide, your indispensable companion, x-rays the impact of social media on electioneering process as electorates present their expectations from incoming government. Meet some TV professionals behind the screen and other inspiring stories in sports, entertainment, and lots more. Grab a copy at the vendor near you or NTA stations nationwide. TV Guide, your indispensable companion.
All right, we thank you for staying with us on Good Morning Nigeria today. And now to the first leg of our conversation this morning. President Muhammadu Buhari has communicated his non-assent to 8 bills passed by the National Assembly in February. The President of the Senate, Dr. Bukola Saraki, made the announcement at plenary on Tuesday, April 2nd. Now, joining us in the studio for the discussion this morning is Senator Itai Enang, Senior Special Assistant to the President on National Assembly Matters. So thank you for joining us this morning on Good Morning Nigeria.
Thank you very much.
Kingsley.
All right, Senator Itai Enang, of course, give us a sense of the bills that the President, as it were, declined to give his assent. And why did he decline to give his assent?
First, let me say that President Muhammadu Buhari has assented to the highest number of bills by any administration. And let me also say, to the credit of the 8th National Assembly, they have passed and forwarded the highest number of bills to the President for assent, higher than any administration from 1999. That's credit of the National Assembly. The National Assembly swore to protect and defend the provisions of the Constitution. And the provisions of the Constitution is that no law that conflicts with any other law or the President cannot assent to any law which is in conflict with the provisions of the Constitution. And the National Assembly also swore not to pass any law which conflicts with the provisions of the Constitution. So, if the National Assembly passes any law which, in the opinion of Mr. President and the law and the Constitution, is infringing on the provisions of the Constitution, the President also swore to protect and defend the Constitution. So the president is bound not to assent to that provision. Now, what are the conditions that are normally considered by Mr. President in assenting or not assenting to a bill? One, if the bill is in conflict with the provisions of the Constitution. Two, if the bill is in respect of a matter where there is an existing law. Three, if the bill purports to make a new law, which there is already in a law in existence, and or in a situation where a bill should amend an existing law, the bill now seeks to make another law instead of amending an existing law. Where the bill wants to conflict with public policy. Now, I give an example. One of them that conflict with the provision of the Constitution is like the Petroleum Industry Bill. With the Petroleum Industry Bill sought to create the Petroleum Regulatory Commission. And the Petroleum Regulatory Commission is to have 10%, is to have and keep 10% of the entire what it makes. And Mr. President says, look, what the Petroleum Regulatory Commission will keep is, one, too much, two, that the money belongs to the three tiers of government. It belongs to the federal government, the state government, the local government, and the Federal Capital Territory and the area councils of the Federal Capital Territory. The president swore to protect and defend the Constitution, including the provision relating to the sharing of revenue to the three tiers of government. Well, this money, if Mr. President assented to the Petroleum Industry Bill, the Petroleum Regulatory Commission will keep over 10%. And this 10% runs into trillions. Not just 1-2 trillion. It runs into trillions. Now, the budget of this country for this year is about 8.843 trillion naira. That is, the Petroleum Regulatory Commission alone will have and keep what amounts to almost the budget of the country. The Petroleum Industry Bill also sought to allow the Petroleum Equalization Fund to keep 5% of the entire value of consumption of petroleum in the country. And that 5% is so huge, humongous, and already the petroleum sector in the country seems to be a country of its own. Then if you give that amount of money to the Petroleum Regulatory Commission and the Petroleum Equalization Fund, you almost make them a continent within Nigeria. The president, who swore to protect the Constitution, has a duty not to assent to any bill that conflicts with the provisions of the Constitution.
All right, thank you. Now, among...
And again, he has to protect other tiers of government. Don't forget, these agencies are under the control of the federal government. The president, if he were lighthearted, if he were a person who doesn't really look much and care much, he would say, this money, after all, will be controlled by an agency of the federal government. But he says, look, this money belongs to the states. It belongs to the local governments and the Federal Capital Territory. I cannot assent to a bill that deprives those agencies of government of the money they are entitled to. I have to protect them as president of Nigeria.
All right, thank you. Now, among the bills that Mr. President declined assent is that of the Ajaokuta State Complex. Let's know more about that. Why did he decline?
The president swore to protect and defend the Constitution, primarily. And let me make it clear. The president is not saying that he is not going to, we're not going to fund Ajaokuta or that Ajaokuta should not be revived. But you have to take money from the right source. The Ajaokuta bill, reactivation bill, seeks to take money from one. It says, I think, $1 billion. Yeah. You don't appropriate in dollars. The Nigerian currency, unless you are taking loan, the Nigerian currency is the naira. Two, you cannot take money from the excess crude account. The excess crude account belongs to the three tiers of government. The excess crude account is the money where any money that is in excess of the benchmark like we have this year's budget, the proposed budget at $60 per barrel. Oil today, yesterday, and some days ago is oscillating between 68, 69 $69 per barrel. Anything in excess of the $60 per barrel goes into the excess crude account. That excess crude account belongs to the federal government, state government, and the federal government, and the local government. The National Assembly and Mr. President can only appropriate the share of the federal government from the excess crude account if this money has been appropriated and the federal government share has been given to the federal government. Senator, that is where we have authority.
I'm not cutting you short, but just to amplify one aspect of what you're explaining. The Ajaokuta Steel Complex is viewed generally as a critical infrastructure when it comes to development. In fact, if Ajaokuta did not suffer a setback as it did over 40 years now, that would have been the hub of steel manufacturing in Africa. Now, to source money to fund it, why would it be a Herculean task?
We can source money to fund it, but you cannot take money from a pool. You cannot take the money. The money that belongs to the 3 tiers of government, the National Assembly cannot appropriate. You can only appropriate the one that has been shared and it belongs to the federal government. It gets from the excess from the federation account. The excess crude account belongs to the federation account before it is shared. When it gets into the federation account, the one that belongs to the federal government will now be given to the federal government. It now gets into the Consolidated Revenue Fund of the federal government. Don't forget, when it is shared, the state's share goes into the Consolidated Revenue Fund of the state. Now, we cannot appropriate it. There was, when I had opportunity by the grace of God to deliver to make a presentation to the senators-elect at the Hilton, senators and honorable members-elect. And they raised a question, because I raised this question and this is an explanation too. And they said, look, how did you get money to fund the Tucano aircraft? And how did you get money why did we take the money that we gave to the security? I said, and this is correct, and the president is correct, that money belonged to the 3 tiers of government. The 3 tiers of government met at the National Economic Council, chaired by the Vice President. The governors agreed that their own money, on behalf of the state government of the 36 states, on behalf of the 668 local governments, on behalf of the Federal Capital Territory, on behalf of the 6 area councils, that we have agreed that $1 billion be given to the federal government for the purpose of fighting insecurity, addressing security. And that is the money that the National Assembly can appropriate, because it has been given from it has left the federation account into the Consolidated Revenue Fund, which the National Assembly can now appropriate. It belongs to the National Assembly. Now, that's the difference. So the president cannot assent to the Ajaokuta Fund because the source of funding is illegal, unconstitutional. But when our money is shared and it gets into like the National Assembly is handling the budget now, it can appropriate.
Distinguished Senator Itai Ennang. Let's get a few things, explained still to our viewers. The first point you made was that on the Ajaokuta finance bill, or funding bill, the president declined because the amount that was supposed to be approved for that $1 billion was denominated in dollars, not in naira, and that the naira, of course, is our national.
I think the main reason is the source, the excess crude account.
Fantastic. That's fine, because even the excess crude account itself is denominated in dollars, usually. I was also wondering, why should this be a problem? Because part of the report that we read was to the effect that rather than having this lump sum taken from the excess crude account, that the funding for Ajaokuta could be by way of, line budgeting, that's to say, year in, year out. Yeah. But we have also seen in public finance in this country how inefficient that could be. That means that a project could drag on for so many years. And as Kyrian was saying, if ordinarily Ajaokuta Steel is supposed to catalyze industrialization in Nigeria, for how many years are you going to draw on line budgeting? That's one leg. Second leg of the question is, again, considering the significance of all of this, what recommendation did the president himself now make in rejecting the bill to say, look, couldn't we co-opt the other tiers of government who are the owners of the funds in the excess crude account to make a contribution to this financing and then convert that contribution into equity?
I agree. Let me please remember one of the things I said first, that the president is not saying we are not going to fund Ajaokuta or we're not going to reactivate Ajaokuta. He's saying that we cannot fund and reactivate Ajaokuta from this source because this source of funding does not belong to us. And so we cannot appropriate from it. In fact, if the president assents to that bill and it becomes an act, all the states in the federation will sue the federal government because it is from a source that they cannot, the National Assembly can't. Where there is an infraction by one arm of government, the other arm should see. Now, what the president and the executive is doing is, now there is a budget. There is a budget pending before the National Assembly. Working with the Minister of Budget and National Planning, working with Mr. President, working with the Minister of Finance, looking at the medium-term expenditure framework, looking at the size of the budget and what is possible to be done, that fund can be made available through the line budget. Don't forget, they may not be able to spend 30, 40 billion in a year. $1 billion is about $1 billion US dollars is about 360 billion naira. Is that not correct? Now, how did we fund Mambila? We are funding Mambila from bullet provision. How are we funding most of this project where we raise bond from SUKOK and other local source of financing? Bullet provision. These are the options that the executive will be looking at in funding because we're interested in reactivating. But you can't be interested in reactivating but in the course of it, you breach a law, and the cause you can have injunction left, right, and center, and the fund does not come out, and then you can't even apply the fund. The president has an intellectual refinery and takes care and caution on every bill. And lawmaking is a very serious process. That is why the Constitution provides that there will be 360 members of the National Assembly to look at every line of the bill and look at the Constitution. 109 senators to look at the bill and look at every portion of the Constitution. 2 chambers of the National Assembly sitting in the House of Representatives and in the Senate, because this is supposed to be a great legislative refinery that looks at the bill. Mr. President, in person and through his intellectual refinery, now looks if the ball escapes from the legislature, the executive will see it. If it doesn't, then it goes to the judiciary, and the court will just strike it down. Yes.
Yeah, I just want to Kyrian, the intellectual refinery can also make this suggestion we're talking about. Look, if we know that, as we know, Ajaokuta has been in the doldrums for several decades now, is there anything wrong with getting the 3 tiers of government to hold stakes in Ajaokuta through their contribution?
That's where I was going, actually.
Yes,
actually. The members of the National Assembly are representatives of constituents, or constituencies from the whole federation. So we own Ajaokuta collectively. In terms of structuring what could lead to its proper funding, for many Nigerians should not be a problem. So why not the 3 tiers of government coming together to say, okay, look, if Ajaokuta works today, it works for everybody, not just for the federal government.
Now, I'm sure we listened 2 days ago to the Minister of Solid Minerals, Abubakar Bawa Buhari, when he explained that the steps that are being taken to reactivate by way of funding Ajaokuta. The Mr. President, the Federal Executive Council, and all the other tiers and all the other agencies are highly interested in funding the reactivation of the Ajaokuta steel rolling mill. And being so interested in funding, there is a provision that there will be, we have so many sources of funding. The president did not reject the bill because he does not want Ajaokuta to be funded. Mr. President declined assent to the bill because he said that he swore to defend the Constitution, that we cannot fund it from this source. And that letter declining assent only had to address the provisions in the bill. It did not have to address alternative, because you address any letter assent to a bill is on the provisions. And when you decline assent, you state only things that are relevant to the provisions. You don't go into extraneous. But the other matter that relates to it will be worked out, and is being worked out through the Ministry of... through the appropriate ministries. And it was discussed by the Federal Executive Council and...
Just before we sign you off, Senator Ita Ena, you were in the House of Reps, you were also in the Senate. Yeah. What could possibly have happened when the two chambers were considering the amendment to the Petroleum Equalization Fund? That fund had been in existence since 1973, and then the establishment of the Petroleum Industry Regulatory Commission, that they decided to, in the law, create a provision that will enable the PEF and then the commission itself, Regulatory Commission, to amass so much funds, such as you have indicated. I mean, was it just the fact that they didn't quite take into consideration the likely consequences of having in the possession of one or two agencies such humongous amounts?
I will plead my privilege, because perhaps anything I say here on this matter may put one institution or the other in bad light in the eyes of the public. But I want to say that with respect to the legislature, with the greatest respect, that we should mind the consultants that we engage in many matters. Because it does appear, even in our days in the House of Representatives, we consider the bill. And this consultancy is led by, we considered the bill. A few of these things arose and we addressed it. A few of them arose, but it escaped our eyes. That is why the bill had not, in many occasions, it been passed, it will not get to the executive. Most of the consultants who work on these matters work for the oil majors. And the issue, the oil majors' interest is how to amass and keep it and make profit, perhaps not in the interest of the country. I will urge my colleagues, my brothers and my friends and my bosses that let us look at the provision of every bill. And let Nigerians and the legislature, the bill still has a provision, the potential of coming into life. The president had addressed these issues. They should just take the issues addressed by the president, address it and send the bill back, and address other issues which were not addressed. So that let them get an auditor, and let an auditor look, 10% of it, what will it amount to for the Petroleum Regulatory Commission? Then 5% of the entire consumption of petroleum in Nigeria to be given or retained by Petroleum Equalization Fund. How much does it amount to? And if this will not amount to making these two agencies a continent within the country of Nigeria.
All right. That would be a banana continent.
Exactly.
From Banana Republic.
Yes. At this point, time can allow us to continue this segment. And at this point, we'd like to appreciate the contribution of Senator Ita Enang. He's the Senior Special Assistant to the President on National Assembly Matters. It's been nice talking to you this morning.
Thank you very much.
Well, we hope that the bill will return to the National Assembly and, of course, come back to the President.
No, it is with the National Assembly now.
Okay.
And at their discretion.
All right. Thank you indeed for coming.
They don't also override the president's veto.
All right. Good Morning Nigeria will continue very shortly as we are prepared to delve into the intricacies of diagnosis and, of course, the entire medical practice in Nigeria.
to dey disobey traffic law, they cause accidents. Me, I don't talk, say, I no go dey do am again, because change begins with me.
Let's cross the other side of the road. I will no longer endanger my life crossing the express. Instead, I will use the bridge, because change begins with me.
Oga driver, stop this bus now, won't come down. I be one carry me past where they go.
Make I dey stop anyhow for road, they cause traffic wahala and accidents. So I go dey stop for the right bus stop, because change begins with me.
Change begins with me.
This message is brought to you by the National Orientation Agency in conjunction with the Federal Ministry of Information and Culture.
All right, now to set the tone for our discussion, Chimaobi Walter Nnaji went on the streets to sample people's opinion on the subject matter of wrong diagnosis.
I've had people who complain like that, or I've taken somebody to the hospital instead of taking the person to the lab to know exactly what is wrong with the person. By the end of the day, they prescribe drugs, and the person has to keep taking the drugs. By the end of the day, it's quite like the illness is still there. Maybe by the time you go back to the hospital again, it's okay, let's run a test. Maybe it's after the test, maybe before the right drugs will be given. But I think sometimes doctors do that first, any kind of first treatment, to give the person the drug first. Maybe assuming, probably by asking question, maybe that what exactly what is wrong with the person. But later, maybe when the test is conducted, it's quite that it's a different thing entirely.
When I get to the hospital, the first thing I will to go for a proper test. But at least I've seen people or I've heard about people who happens to fall a victim of that kind of thing. And I think the motivating thing about it is not the doctor per se. Maybe some, the situation of the country, they may not have enough money to go through that rigorous processes. That is going for test. You just tell the doctor, I'm feeling stomach pain and I think it's typhoid. Treat me for typhoid.
Equipment side, obsolete equipment sometimes can give you a wrong report. When they are obsolete, they can't give you factual. There are modern technologies. I keep emphasizing on Singapore. There are diagnostic machines that will give you a comprehensive analysis of what the person's health condition is, internally and externally. So the government can invest more on these areas instead of jeopardizing the life of the citizens by guesswork. Most times you see somebody having headache and he's treated for typhoid. Just a little correction and he'll be fine and off the hospital.
I think we should put a lot of money into research projects. I think maybe this one will eliminate the issue of misdiagnosis. But the issue is not only in Nigeria. Like I said, there are cases where there have been litigations, even outside this country, even in advanced countries, maybe sometimes out of carelessness, or sometimes somebody wanted to experiment on something, and he will do it maybe deliberately to see what happens, and then it backfires. So all of them are there.
All right, thank you very much, Chimaobi Walter Nnaji, for the views that you solicited from some members of the Nigerian public. Now we have with us in the studios, as well as also joining us via Skype, my colleague Kirian will introduce the Skype participant in the conversation. Let's first welcome Dr. Francis Faduyile. He's an associate professor and consultant pathologist, and is president of Nigerian Medical Association. Dr. Faduyile, pleasure to have you with us on the program.
Thank you very much. My pleasure being here.
Also here with us in the studios is Dr. Enejo Abdul. He is Assistant Registrar and Head of Department Professional Discipline of the Medical and Dental Council of Nigeria. Dr. Abdul, pleasure to have you with us on the program.
Thank you very much.
Here with us in the Abuja studios as well is Kasmer Ifeanyi, the National Publicity Secretary, Association of Medical Scientists of Nigeria. Kasmer, pleasure to have you with us.
Pleasure to have you. It's Association of Medical Laboratory Scientists of Nigeria.
Association of Medical
Laboratory
Scientists. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And from Lagos, we have also with us this morning Dr. Laz Udez, CEO of Pink Oak Cancer Trust. It's our pleasure to welcome you to Good Morning Nigeria today.
Thank you, Kieran.
Via Skype in Atlanta, USA, we have Dr. Isioma Okoba, family health consultant and currently chairman, Delta State Primary Healthcare Development Agency. Madam, thank you for joining us all the way from Atlanta.
It's a pleasure to be with you today.
All right, doctors and medical lab scientists, a pleasure to have you with us again on the program. Let's just begin by having a sense of the proper understanding of what medical diagnosis is all about. And let's begin with Dr. Fadile. What is medical diagnosis? And in explaining or defining that, what is the difference, medical diagnosis, ancient and modern?
Thank you very much. Medical diagnosis is the totality of the decision on the cause of the illness of any patient who has come to visit a medical doctor. The medical diagnosis has a lot to do with the patient primarily, because patient has to tell you what and what are wrong with the doctor. Secondly, the medical diagnosis also has a lot to do with the doctor, who will now do the proper history taking and look at the salient points, the positive, the negatives. Then it will now do examination, physical examination, and it is the physical examination that will have to be married with the history taking. It is after that you will now decide the pathway to go. The pathway to go can be directly, you can say this is what is wrong, go straight to treat. You can feel that, look, I am not fully convinced of what has caused this illness. Then he would come out with a management plan which will include all forms of investigation. The investigation can range from radiology investigation, from the X-ray. It can range from test of urine, blood, or it can take some particulate cell from the patient that will be treated. And it will marry all these reports at the end of the day with the physical examination, with the history he has taken, then we make a decision. And it is at that level of decision that we say this is the diagnosis of that patient. And importantly, the patient has a central role in this, because it is what the patient presents and tells the doctor or whoever sees him or her that will determine the final outcome of how the treatment will be.
All right, thank you. Ancient and modern, but that is exactly what an area I also want Dr. Nejo to address, the issue of being ancient or modern methods of diagnosis. Of course, there are many dimensions to diagnostic process. So let's get your view of medical diagnosis, if there is ancient or modern, as the case may be.
Well, as you said from the beginning, more from the regulatory point of view. But I would say that medical diagnosis basically is the process of determining what the problem is with a patient. That could range from simply listening to the patient. Sometimes it could be just looking at the patient. The doctor could decide this is what is wrong with the patient, what we call spot diagnosis, or listening to the person. By intuition and other means, he could tell, okay, this is what is wrong with the patient, or he listens to him. He has a range of possibilities which he thinks could be the problem. He examines the patient to determine whether or not the physical signs supporting what he's thinking are there or not. He adds them up. And sometimes he could make his diagnosis at that point, or he's still unable to determine what is wrong. He gets to the point of requesting an investigation, which could be either imaging, blood test, or other kinds of tests. From the ancient perspective, if you may, is basically ranging from what the traditional people will do. Some will use divinity. They could divine or invoke spirits and things like that to determine that that is not my core. Now, from the point of view of the Medical and Dental Council for the purpose of regulation, we look at diagnosis from the doctor's conduct in approaching or interacting with the patient in arriving at his diagnosis, treatment, and what have you. We are much more interested in that perspective.
All right, Dr. Edejo Abdul, thank you very much. Let's bring in now Kasmia Ifanye, who is of the Association of Medical Lab Scientists. What's medical diagnosis?
You cannot,
what role do you play in
You cannot talk about medical diagnosis in this day and time and not talk about evidence-based diagnosis. The NMA president spoke elaborately on diagnosis, but before you get to the point of making a diagnosis, there has to be empirical data, and reliance on the empirical data will therefore enable you make an evidence-based diagnosis. In this time and day, modern healthcare, it is no longer speculative. We must take diagnosis away from making it very subjective, so long as you cannot give evidence in empirical form for whatever diagnosis you are arriving at. That is sheer guesswork. And the patient before you will certainly be in trouble, because the essence of diagnosis is for you to discern, to decipher, to distinguish, to determine, and therefore provide an explanation for the signs and the symptoms, like Dr. Fadile said, which would come primarily from the patient. So it is when you have all this, you take together, it's a coordinated activity. A patient sits before you today, and you listen to the patient, and you arrive at a diagnosis. Honestly, you talked about ancient. That belonged to the time past, not today's world, where the mainstay is evidence-based medical practice.
Okay.
Thank you.
You know what he really mentioned, Kingsley, is
let me say ancient. I mean, ancient can be very remote. It can also be recent. Sometimes, maybe it's part of the physicians will tell us. When you go, they'll first put your hand like this. It's very hard. Then in some cases, they will draw your hand like this, So.
They say you have malaria. You got so that's the diagnosis by intuition, All right, now let's go to Dr. Laz Udeze, the CEO of Pink Oak Cancer Trust, who is in Lagos there. Dr. Udeze, now diagnosis can be complex, and it requires a high degree of certainty, before a decision can be taken on the patient's problem. What's our own view about medical diagnosis as we have it here in this part of the world?
Thank you very much, Kirian and other guests in the studio. I think I have to build on what the previous guests have said. And diagnosis is just all about finding the cause of whatever the patient presents with. And in getting to do this, it means you need to have competent persons. Of course, the approach should be patient-focused. And patient-focused should be that whatever we are doing as healthcare practitioners, the doctors, the lab scientists, and radiologists, everybody that is involved in making a diagnosis have to be in the best interest of the patient. And also, you also have to be in such a way that it does not necessarily extort the patient. I'm kind of focusing on that of the patient, because whatever we do, if it goes right, it's to the benefit of the patient. If it does not go right, the patient is also the one that bears the brunt. So by looking at diagnosis, I also want us to look at the health system as a whole and how the health system supports this. Our health system, as defined by the National Health Act 2014, has to do with the primary health care, secondary health care, and tertiary health care. And also, we also have systems at facility level, that's the hospitals, the clinics, the diagnostic centers, the pharmaceutical stores or pharmacy outlets. And we also have at the community level, where we should have the World Health System, the Village Development Committee, and the World Health Committees that, are part of the primary health care. So, yes, in making diagnosis in our climb, I agree with Kashmir about evidence-based diagnosis, and that's also have to do with getting information from the patient and also applying the appropriate test. But we also have to agree that in our climb in the country, it's not every part of the country that we have this access, where you can go to a lab where you have competent hands that are trained to carry out these tests, or where you have manpower in health facilities who are trained to get it done. So in those kind of places, speculative diagnosis cannot be ruled out. So yes, we want every diagnosis to be evidence-based, but the reality is that the health facilities across the country, not all of them have the manpower first, and even some where you have the manpower, they don't have the equipment, and even some where you have the equipment to get these tests done, sometimes they break down, and you don't have people with the capacity to maintain this equipment. And a whole lot of these play out in determining the kind of diagnosis we make and how soon we make this diagnosis. So it's important that in the discourse, we take all this into consideration, and also persons in hard-to-reach communities. Do you insist on evidence-based diagnosis before you give care and run the risk of losing the patient before the patient gets to the nearest health facility? Or can you, out of clinical experience of the health workers, based on the history, make a presumptive diagnosis, get to treat, which may work or may not work? So these are decisions that healthcare practitioners make at various levels.
Thank you very much, Dr. Laz Udeze. We will return to you in the course of the conversation. Let's go over now to Dr. Isioma Okoba. She's joining us via Skype from Atlanta. We know that it's still small hours in Atlanta, probably about 3 a.m., I believe. Dr. Okoba, give us your sense of what medical diagnosis is in top range of healthcare systems. That's one. And now we are drilling into the issues of medical diagnosis. Even with the best of facilities and personnel, could the diagnosis be misleading?
I want to say thank you for having me on this program, and I'd build on what the other professionals have already said. Diagnosis is actually the identification of the disease or condition, and through a very systematic analysis of the history, and also physical examinations of the signs and symptoms of the patient, and then further evaluation with tests, which can be laboratory or radiological, to assess the probable cause of the disease or the condition. And in knowing all of this, we know that the patient has to give the right information, and then the doctor has to be well trained to be able to identify the signs and symptoms that we're talking about. And what we now have discovered is that a lot of our doctors or professionals in the healthcare system in Nigeria as a whole, the quality that we turn out, it's actually not as good as it used to be many years ago. And this could be attributed to poor budgetary allocation to the professional institutions. And then sometimes some people actually buy their license or grades with money. And so we turn out not so good professionals, because we need good professionals to be able to make this diagnosis and don't either mislead the patient with a misdiagnosis or delay the diagnosis. And so when we have the quality of our professionals taken care of, and then making sure that our professionals are accountable, they have the interest of the patient at heart to give very good health outcomes, then we are actually tackling the process of misdiagnosis, delayed diagnosis that can actually lead to very bad health outcomes. And then we also look at the fact that the infrastructure in Nigeria, it's really, most of them are not up to standard to actually offer the health services. My other colleague talked about the primary healthcare facilities, secondary and tertiary. In most of these facilities, they're not up to standard. And then most of them also do not have the right equipment. Even if they have the equipment, the basic equipment, you can go to a primary healthcare center and even basic equipment such as the sphygmomanometer, which is the blood pressure measuring equipment, it's not proper. Sometimes they are taped around with plaster, Band-Aid. And so tell me how you can get the simple vital signs such as blood pressure, or they don't even have a glucometer just to check simple blood sugar. So we know that the challenges that we face with actually giving right diagnosis in Nigeria will be first, the human resources, the capacity, the human capacity. And then we'll also talk about the infrastructure, we talk about the medical equipment, and then we also look at the referral system. Because if you see, like they stated earlier, that in the primary healthcare level, most of them are remote and hard to reach places. So the health workers really do not have all that knowledge. But there should be a strong referral system where they cannot handle it. It's quick to refer the patient. So there's no delayed diagnosis or delayed treatment, and so no bad outcome. And then if we have that strong referral system in place, that's also going to be helpful. And another thing that would be very helpful, it's the health insurance. If every person in Nigeria has access to health insurance, then that means the cost is no longer a barrier to accessing healthcare. That means they can access healthcare even before it becomes bad or dangerous at very preventive levels. I want to use this opportunity to say that I am the chairman of the Delta State Primary Healthcare Development Agency, and my governor, Senator Dr. Ifeanyi Okowa, has actually introduced the Delta State Contributory Health Insurance Scheme, which has really given access to a lot of Deltans in Delta State to access quality healthcare. So it's really key that we imbibe the health insurance to be able to give the patients access to quick and early diagnosis. Then we also want to look at the regulatory bodies. I'm glad we have our colleague here, because we know that the regulatory bodies need to be strengthened to be able to make sure that the activities carried out in these health facilities are up to standard, and the facilities are up to standard, and the equipments are up to standard. And once we get all of this in place, and then make sure that we train our professionals, training and retraining. Like here in the United States, every 2 years we have to renew our license. And before you renew your license, you have to have X amount of continuing medical education credits. And so if for every professional in Nigeria, you have to go through all that training and retraining, then at that point, when you have a patient in front of you, then you know what the technology is. And I also would like to say that in Nigeria, we would like to imbibe innovation, medical innovation, because with health information technology, it has been able to drive medical diagnosis. Take, for example, you have a patient goes to a hospital. That's the physical infrastructure we're talking about, the electricity. And so they can do the x-ray. Even if they do it, simple x-ray, there's no radiologist to read it. But if we do have health information technology via the electronic medical records, somebody in Kaduna can be reading an x-ray for somebody in Asaba. So we need to imbibe the health information technology, also the health insurance scheme. And I want to use this opportunity to say that my governor, Senator Dr. Ifeanyi Okowa of Delta State, has put all this in place to make sure that all Deltans have access to quality and effective health care.
Thank you, Dr. Isiama Okoba. Not just the Deltans, but all Nigerians would like to have good health care. Thank you very much indeed for your first comment on this conversation. Now, back to Abuja. I want to ask Dr. Adedayo to look at this now, because one important element when it comes to medical practice is prognosis. And there can be no effective prognosis without effective diagnosis, in which case a medical professional, cannot have an informed or educated guess on what will be the outcome of the treatment or medication that he has been administering on a patient. Now, these two inseparable elements, how much of attention is given to them by the medical practitioners in Nigeria?
Well, thank you very much. I think it's good for us to know that when we talk about evidence-based medicine, it goes beyond investigations. A medical practitioner passes through school and learns skills from history taking, from physical examination, touching, and these are evidence-based. And again, if you want to treat a patient, you treat a patient, not a result. Because these are some of the areas that we have misconception in the public. For example, they take a sample from you. You have a sample from your catheter, urine, that produces a channel that takes urine. And it says that you have Staph aureus, which is an organism that you need to treat. As a practitioner, when you see that result, you may even, seeing that result, decide to discountenance that result, because every other things, from your history taking, from the physical examination, from how the patient looks like, that patient may not have that Staph aureus infection. It can be something that had been taken outside. But outside, they said, look, I have done a test, this is this. We don't treat investigation results. We treat patients. And it is important for us to state that. And when you are talking about prognosis, prognosis is the possible outcome of that illness. Okay? And these are things in which you have to compartmentalize all the constituent parts, including the investigations. Okay? If you are likely going to have a prognosis that is not too good, because if you are going to the world of prognosis, is another thing. Sometimes we are talking about a cancer that is maybe is a life-threatening one, that there is nothing, that prognosis is bad. So you may have to shift the treatment to a palliative treatment and not a treatment for curative or therapeutic. Okay? That is about prognosis. And lastly, for me to state importantly, when you are saying ancient and modern, today, we are no more using the test in which you go to facilities and you see big equipments. We have moved to patient-directed investigation. I can stay here, put something on my wrist. It can take my blood pressure. It can take my urea level. It can take a lot of investigation within my body. Okay, we can do ordinary breath tests, and that is the sophistication that our colleague in UK and US was talking about. So what we are saying now is that the premise of wrong diagnosis in this country, it is based on a wrong belief that you treat test investigation results. We don't treat investigation results.
All right, Dr. Fadile, thanks a lot. I would like the other physicians to also respond to the point you have made, beginning with Dr. Laz Udeze. in Lagos. Dr. Laz Udeze in Lagos, CEO of Pink Oak Cancer Trust. Please respond to this. Earlier you were talking about speculative diagnosis, presumptive diagnosis, but Dr. Faduile has now expanded the conversation to say that the premise of the erroneous impression amongst the general populace is that doctors or physicians should treat the outcome of an investigation, which is to say a result, and not the patient. And he is saying that they treat the patient and not a result. What does that mean?
Thank you very much. I agree absolutely with Dr. Faduile on that because the health-seeking behavior of our people tend to affect how the diagnosis goes sometimes or even what we get to treat. We're in a society where when people get ill, the first place they go to is to go to a diagnostic center, and that's not right. I think when people get ill, the first you see a healthcare provider. It could be a medical doctor in a general hospital or a health center or a clinic. If he's at a primary healthcare center, you may meet a nurse, a midwife, a community health extension worker, or community health officer that is trained to be able to diagnose some simple health conditions. So the first step in diagnosis is, first of all, the patient saying, this is what is wrong with me. That's history. And the skill of history taking is the most important skill in even engaging the patient. And when the patient says, this is what is wrong with me, and the next step is physical examination, where the healthcare provider will look at the patient, check various parts of the body. And from there, if patients say, I have fever, there are over 100 things that may cause fever. But it's from the history and the examination that the healthcare provider will be able to say, okay, maybe it could be what we call differential diagnosis. You may have like 3 or 4 possible things in mind. And based on that, it will now say, okay, go and do this investigation. You know, so, and after doing the investigation, the patient comes back to the healthcare provider, and the healthcare provider interprets the result of the investigation, bearing in mind the findings during the history and physical examination. It's on that basis that a diagnosis is done. So what Dr. Fadile has explained is that you just walk straight to a lab and they do a test, which many people get to do, and they just go straight, and next they call a doctor and say, I did a test, they say I have typhoid. What medication do I take? It is not correct. In fact, typhoid fever is one of the most wrongly diagnosed in this country, because the test they do to tell everybody that has fever, even if you don't have fever, just go to the lab. If you've ever had typhoid in your life and you do a Widal test, for instance, it will always come up, significant titer. They will tell you you have typhoid, and they put people on antibiotics for like 10 days or 2 weeks, which also leads to another problem in the abuse of antibiotics and formation of resistance to treatment with antibiotics. So, and that's where the regulation agencies come into play, looking at the practice. One of the challenges we have, apart from the training aspect, we need to begin to look at this even from the training institutions. Medical schools, what facilities do they have? What quality of training are people getting? The School of Health Technologies, do they have the right equipment and the people with the capacity and the right training to train them? Even those who are already employed, who are working, are they being trained periodically with new innovations in the area of diagnosis? I agree with the Isioma on health access or health insurance. In 2 days' time, we'll have World Health Day, and the WHO has set universal health coverage, as a theme of this year's World Health Day, and it's looking at, removing the financial barriers. One of the things that make people try to cut corners is because they cannot afford to pay out of pocket to access healthcare. So you see them trying to cut corners, maybe first of all, not seeing a doctor or any other healthcare provider and just bypassing those things, and end up sometimes with complications that will still bring them back to where they were supposed to start. So,
All right. Thank you indeed, Dr. Udeze, because you have raised a number of issues. But Kingsley, what is significant is that of typhoid fever wrongly diagnosed in Nigeria. I recall when Professor Olikayo Ransom Kuti was the health minister in this country, and he made some significant statements about typhoid fever, saying that he was not sure at that time that it does exist, because there are many kind of feverish conditions you can get. Right. But he was saying he was not sure really that typhoid was here. That was then. But returning to our conversation this morning, let's go to Dr. Isioma. We would like you to respond to the question that Kingsley put to Dr. Udeze that has to do with treat the patient and not the result. We've also heard from Udeze differential diagnosis, speculative diagnosis, and presumptive diagnosis. What do these things mean to you?
It is so correct what my colleagues have said, because you cannot overemphasize the need to get a proper history and physical examination. Trust me, 90% of our diagnosis is gotten from a proper history taking and physical examination. So the whole purpose of diagnosis is to make sure that the professionals are well trained, they have the skill to be able to take that history and then examine the patient. And if you do that well, you will be halfway through getting the diagnosis. And then at that point, you get your differentials. So for example, like they said, fever, many causes of fever. But by the time you take a good history, you narrow this down to maybe one probable diagnosis and maybe 2 or 3 differentials. And then based on that, then you send them for your investigations. It could be in form of laboratory or radiological. And then when those results come, you take the results in total with the patient history and the physical examination that you have done earlier as a physician and arrive at an accurate diagnosis. Yes, we practice evidence-based medicine, and that's all inclusive. But trust me, more than half of the percentage of diagnosis is gotten from a good history taking and physical examination. And then if you can't get the accurate diagnosis, you can now request for laboratory or radiological investigations, and that will help you come to close to 100% diagnosis, accurate diagnosis, and that way you don't miss your diagnosis, you don't have wrong diagnosis, or you don't delay diagnosis leading to delayed treatment. So I totally agree with my colleagues back in Lagos and Abuja.
Thank you very much, Dr. Isioma Okoba. Thank you. We'll return to you presently. But let's bring in now Dr. Eneja Abdul of the Medical and Dental Council of Nigeria. That's professional discipline. A layman would ask this question: if you treat a patient and not a result, why subject me as a patient to medical or laboratory investigation?
Thank you. Just that question is important in the sense that it brings out what Dr. Faduli was trying to point out, the presence of the enemy. When you see a patient, a properly trained doctor, and he's saying that it's important to know that there is a difference significantly in being a medical practitioner and being a healthcare practitioner. A doctor is a medical practitioner. He sees the patient. He examines, he clerks the patient, which includes taking a history from that patient, examining him, and determining what the problem is. He decides whether or not he needs to proceed to an investigation in determining what is wrong with the patient. The evidence is not necessarily laboratory or radiological. The evidence could be as simple as palpating and feeling the patient's temperature, empirically seeing that the temperature is very high, this person has a high fever. That is evidence. Or percussing the person's chest and it is dull to percussion. This person has a pneumonia on the basis of the history I have taken. He needs not proceed. The treatment is clear. He could treat at that point. Subjecting the person to a test, it is on a patient-by-patient basis. If the patient's symptoms and clinical signs suggest that he needs further investigation, he will be subjected to investigation. If not, there will be no need to do that.
Okay, thank you. I'm sure Casimir Ifeanyi is not totally agreeing with this because in his first comment, he talked about evidence-based diagnosis. And Casimir, do you agree really, that the patient should be treated and not the result of the diagnosis that he or she may have passed through that will produce an evidence of what exactly is wrong? From what Dr. Abdul said, if you feel somebody's body and, maybe it's hot, perhaps it's fever. But what kind of fever are we talking about here? Is it malaria fever or typhoid fever? Because in this country, I have seen many a time somebody will have malaria fever and typhoid fever at the same time. And these treatments are going on simultaneously for two different people. I'll ask someone, look, how come you have malaria and typhoid at the same time in this very body? So let's hear from Casimir.
Thank you very much. I'll start with making reference to Professor Elebute, the former Provost College of Medicine, University of Lagos. And he did say, a clinician that will meet or that is not provided with laboratory investigation will do two things. He will fail to arrive at the correct diagnosis. And when he does fail to arrive at correct diagnosis, he will therefore fail to alleviate the condition of his patient. And what is he going to do? He will either give the wrong treatment, and so the condition of the patient won't be alleviated, or he will give alternative treatment, as is the case you are talking about now, treating for malaria and typhoid, and ultimately he will become a surveyor of polypharmacy, which is detrimental to the patient. Now, let me also deal with specifics.
What is surveyor of polypharmacy?
That means when you give, like he said, you have been treated for malaria, you have been treated for typhoid, you'll be given several alternative treatments because he has no diagnosis. He has failed to establish a diagnosis on the basis of evidence. Let me also deal with specifics. Across the globe, it is well known that 70% or more of clinical decisions, diagnosis, treatment, and patient's management and evaluation are premised on empirical data coming largely from medical laboratory investigations. Now, having said that, let me deal with the example you gave of feeling how hot or cold a patient's skin is. It is subjective because some people naturally have very hot bodies. And so, if I take a thermometer and apply either to the beneath the tongue or beneath here, and it reads, it gives me data, number. It says this patient's body is hot to this degree in centigrade. For example, 39, 40 degrees centigrade, way above normal. That is data, empirical. That is evidence. You're palpating the patient's body is subjective and biased. Now, having said that, you see, the truth is this. You treat a patient, not the result, but you require the laboratory or investigation report to treat the patient, to arrive at a diagnosis. Let's also put it straight. These are all exposed persons, including our sister that spoke from the US. Today in the US, if you just want to have information about your health status, assuming you are not really sick, you just want to have information. There are several laboratories sitting in your room, in your bedroom. You go online, you request what you want to find about your health status, and they will dispatch, I have the names of the laboratories, they will dispatch the materials to you, give you instruction on how to sample, and you return. And they will send you a code. You will enter their website, and you have your results. In the UK, for example, there's a diagnostic, medical laboratory outfit called Medical Diagnosis. That's the name in the UK. It's in not London. The same thing. So a situation where you want to discourage people, that the only time they can have information, it is inalienable, the right of a citizen to have information about his health status. But if you are sick, you go to a health facility. And when you come into a health facility, please, for goodness sake, I have said the emphasis, the emphasizing investigation on arriving at diagnosis is to the detriment of the patient. Dr. Soma also gave example of a sphygmomanometer. Somebody comes before you, a clinician. For goodness sake, with all the history you are going to take, if you do not take the person's, whether it is point of care testing or with a big stick, if you do not take the blood pressure, it will also come in number. It will give you data, evidence. That is where the world is.
All right, Kashmir, fine. I would still like to stick with you before we give the physicians the opportunity of responding. This has been part of our national experience, and in fact is the instigation for this topic today. Kirian, you asked the question. Sometimes a patient presents with fever and is being treated for malaria. Later he's told that, no, it's not malaria, it's supposed to be typhoid. And a few patients have died, in that process. What is wrong with our diagnostic system that there appears to be, as it were, the high incidence of, or the incidence of misdiagnosis? Somebody is being treated for one reason because the results from the lab show something. We also have it with cancer. Some patients who leave this country on medical tourism say that, oh, your doctor was treating you for this one. When he gets to wherever he or she has gone to, they run a series of tests and said, no, you were being treated for the wrong thing. What is wrong?
Thank you very much. What is wrong is that there is a conscious effort to de-emphasize investigative medicine in Nigeria, to de-emphasize medical laboratory services. Nigerians are listening to us. Visit facilities. We have 22 federal medical centers across the length and breadth of Nigeria. We have about 59 teaching hospitals across the length and breadth of Nigeria. We have about 33,000 general hospitals and well over 20,000 primary healthcare centers. Now, following our health system, your first port of call should be the primary healthcare system. Unfortunately, even with the reviewed minimum health package, the laboratory component is conspicuously missing. And so you go to a primary healthcare center, you cannot get basic testing. Look at the primary healthcare center here in Abuja at Kuchingoro. Any person who goes there to access care will be well satisfied because the laboratory component is well factored into it. Unfortunately, you have just one of that instance out of the over 20,000. Now, the issue about wrong diagnosis. Whenever you have issue about wrong diagnosis, you must look at, first, infrastructure. Look at equipment. And that's why I refer Nigerians to pay costly visits to these facilities so mentioned. And you will see how run down the infrastructure, the facilities, the equipment in the labs are as we speak today. Very many obsolete. Now, the point is this. Where is the world? What do we do? Okay. Fine. What we must do is that we must mainstream in our laboratory services, laboratory quality management system. What does it do? Laboratory quality management system will not guarantee you an error-free laboratory testing or process, but it guarantees that you dictate error whenever it does happen. And so all these federal health medical centers, teaching hospitals, as I mentioned, general hospitals that have laboratories, how many of them have been given the free hand to institutionalize laboratory quality management system? And I have talked about obsolete equipment, I talked about dilapidated infrastructure, talking about training. Of course, the training may not be at its best because of also related factors. But the point is that it need to be said that well over 7,000 Nigerian doctors are practicing in the UK and are top-notch. And thousands of other healthcare professionals, medical laboratory scientists, nurses, etc., also in the same client. In fact, last week there was a ceremony to that effect, and they read the numbers. It was very staggering. So these ones largely trained in Nigeria are migrated. It's not about capacity. It's not about knowledge deficit. It is political. and we must deal with the issue of the politics in the health sector and salvage the health sector and save Nigerians. Now, the point is...
What is the politics?
What is the politics? Does it involve INEC? No, really, it doesn't involve INEC. That's the election. But of course, when you witness an NMA election, you know that INEC is because NMA election is a very tough election. All right. Thank you indeed, Kasimia Ifeanyi, for defending your constituency so profusely. I appreciate that. Now, let's come to Dr. Francis Adebayo Faduile. Just address some of the issues you raised. And, of course, the issue of misdiagnosis as a result of lack of modern facilities and all of that. We also know that there is what is called IT risks, which is, of course, confronting the diagnostic process at all junctures of the process. Because it's an IT risk, we're not applying the IT information that you have, in trying to read the diagnosis. So please respond.
Thank you very much. I need to bring out something very fast. I'm a laboratory physician. I'm a pathologist. So I understand what my friend is talking about. Yeah. However, he's going on a wrong premise. He's not a doctor. He didn't pass through medical school. He doesn't know when we are talking about history taking or doing physical examination. And he cannot say it is about profession. When doctors say, these are the things you have seen. These are the things you have seen. Back to what you have asked. Treatment of malaria and typhoid. Certainly, there was a test, like I said, a rapid test for malaria. We have used it severally in some hospitals, and we dump them. You know why? Because most of them are negative. What have we seen? Fever. The empirical treatment is fever without any cause, treat malaria. But I can tell you, most fever are not malaria. They are not even typhoid. They are just stress. And by the time you pass through this, you go to the laboratories, laboratory will bring something for you. But as a doctor, there's not, if all of us here, if we do our malaria parasite, it will be positive because we are in a hollow endemic area of that. So it does not mean that you have MP means you have malaria. These are other things that they may not know. But let's go back to the question. Let's go back to the question that you have asked. The question you have asked is important for all of us to know that your health is about to be taken by a professional who understands the treatment of the health. It is wrong for you to say you are a custodian of your health, then you can download and do everything. And this is one of the areas that IT has come big into health, because we have patients now who has gone to download everything, who has had some wrong information about some of the results. Meanwhile, you have to, for example, if you have wider positive and you look at the full blood count, you expect to see leukopenia, you expect to see lymphocytosis, which that one will give you that, look, this wider may be positive or not, or negative. So I want to say, it is very wrong impression. For you, there is no way they will do a test on you that they will not see something. But it does not mean you are sick. Every one of us. Okay. So
I just wondering, Dr. Faduile, thanks. We have a number of tweets that have come in from our viewers. We should be able to take some of them. But just one point, still on, of course, if you like, the politics of the healthcare system and the professionals therein. Dr. Enejo Abdul, again, tell us something. I mean, a number of us have lived in this country for decades. This issue of misdiagnosis, look, when we were growing up, maybe we didn't know it then, but even what you got was malaria. But it would appear that in the past 3 decades or so, typhoid came on. So even when they are testing for malaria, they are also doing the wider test. And sometimes, as Kerry and my colleague said, you have a simultaneous treatment. What exactly is wrong, with the results that you get from the lab, and how might this be tackled? Very quickly.
Thank you very much. I will go back to the question at the beginning. What is diagnosis? And one question we did not answer. Who is qualified to diagnose a patient. Nobody else is except a doctor, registered by the Medical and Dental Council. The doctor is a person who is trained and equipped to make a diagnosis in a human being. The problem we have is we have a lot of persons who are not doctors who dabble into making diagnoses. And that is where you now have issues of supposed misdiagnosis. You have people who run a test, like my colleague, my president, pointed out. If you run a VIDA test in everybody here, it will be positive. The reason is simple. We are in a underdeveloped society that does not have very high quality hygiene.
Okay, let's stop you there because of want of time, you know, but it's also good for us to know that there are people who don't even get malaria at all. There are people who have not malaria in their life. I have seen one. Me, I don't get it. It can take 5-6 years before I get one.
Having malaria is you don't get sick from malaria.
Okay, not that
but
you
if
don't have the
bitten
symptoms
by a mosquito, you will have malaria parasite.
Present. Okay, thank you. We have a tweet, as Kingsley rightly pointed out. Now, Innocent Yawal James, well, we can't just take all. The question we should ask ourselves is why are Nigerian medical practitioners jetting out to settle in other countries?
Patience Tomo has this tweet. Most doctors assume the job of radiologists, scans and radiographs are to be done by a radiologist. A sister was being treated for ulcer for 2 years before we were directed to a radiologist at Bida, whom we were told never misses a diagnosis. There we found she had gallbladder stones.
These things are happening everywhere. Nigerian doctors are professional, that's from Ahmed, but what they lack is inadequate equipment and machinery to perform their duty with utmost good faith. Many of our hospitals often lack government intervention in terms of how to perform their duty.
This is coming from Festus Akimboyo. It says, we put our trust in doctors and other health professionals. Sadly, many of these misdiagnose in many cases, especially for diseases that have similar symptoms, either because they are in a hurry, lack training, or lack tools. Doctors and health professionals must be well trained.
All right, Kingsley.
That's just others, of course. This one is coming from Uche Obeta. Misdiagnosis is an understatement. What do you expect when certified and licensed professionals are not employed? Rather, quacks are employed to diagnose patients.
All right. At this point, we conclude this program, Kingsley.
Yeah.
I want to thank our guests who actually did justice to the topic of today. Dr. Francis Adede of Fadule, Associate Professor and Consultant Pathologist, also President of Nigerian Medical Association.
Thank you very
for
much.
coming in
it's a pleasure
to
being
the
here.
program. Yes.
All right. Well, Kirian, the other guests, of course, let's appreciate them very quickly. Kashma Ifanye, who is National Public Secretary of the Association of Medical Lab Scientists of Nigeria. Thank you very much for being around.
Yeah, it's a
We also would like to thank Dr. Enejo Abdul. Dr. Enejo Abdul.
Next time,
hang on a second, please. This is a very important subject matter, and Kirian, I think we may have to return to it at some
point. We did justice to it, but yes, we need a second round.
We need a second round of this. Dr. Enejo Abdul of the Medical and Dental Council of Nigeria, thanks a lot for being with us. We also would like to appreciate Dr. Laz Udeze, joined us from our Lagos Network studios. And via Skype from Atlanta in the U.S., we have Dr. Isioma Okoba. Dr. Okoba, thanks a lot for being with us on the program today. Well, of course, to all our guests, the physicians, and the lab scientists, it's been a subject matter that, of course, should warrant a re-examination. A re-examination so that we have a proper diagnosis of the problem.
And a wider.
Just know that wider.
All right, okay.
All right, and that's Good Morning Nigeria for today. We thank you for watching. We'll see you again on Monday. I am Kirian Umayo.
Have a nice weekend. I'm Kingsley Osandolo.